lonely rancher lived alone for years until he found a woman tied for wolves, Wild West stories. Caleb Thorne had lived 10 years in silence, punishing himself for the fire that had taken his wife and son. But that silence shattered the moment he saw the wolves. Down in the canyon floor, a woman lay broken and bleeding, her ankle twisted, her breath shallow. The pack circled closer, their yellow eyes fixed on her as if she were already dead. Caleb pulled his horse to a halt, rifle in hand. He had sworn never to care again, never to risk his heart. Yet as her defiant eyes met his across the dust and the howls of the wolves, Caleb knew he could not ride past, not this time. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the parched earth, every movement deliberate, silent. The wolves snarled at his approach, hackles raised, but Caleb did not hesitate. His rifle came up smooth and steady, as natural to him as breathing. One shot cracked through the canyon, echoing like thunder. The lead wolf yelped and darted back into the shadows, the other scattering with a chorus of frustrated howls. The silence that followed was broken only by the woman's ragged breathing. Caleb lowered his rifle slowly, scanning the ridge lines. Out here, wolves were dangerous, but men were worse. He knew well enough that predators on 2 legs might not be far behind. At last, his gaze returned to her. She was young, though the desert had already carved hardship into her face. Her dark hair was tangled with dust, her dress torn and bloodied. Yet her eyes still burned, fierce and unyielding. It was the same fire he had once seen in his wife when she shielded their boy from the storm, before the flames took them both. The memory stabbed him sharp and sudden, but he pushed it down. Caleb knelt beside the woman. For a long moment, his calloused hands hovered above her, unsure. 10 years without touching another soul, 10 years building a fortress of grief. Yet here he was, reaching across that wall. Finally, he slid his arms beneath her fragile frame. She weighed almost nothing, like carrying smoke. As he lifted her, the ghost of another memory struck him. His boy Daniel, asleep in his arms, warm and trusting. His chest tightened, but he did not let go. The woman stirred faintly, a whisper of breath escaping her lips. Caleb couldn't make out the words, only the raw struggle to hold on. He looked once more at the empty desert around them, then at his cabin far off in the canyon's bend. His life had been nothing but silence, a tomb he had built for himself. But tonight that tomb had a living heartbeat inside it. With a grim set to his jaw, Caleb started the long walk back. Each step carried more than her weight. It carried the weight of choice. For 10 years he had chosen silence. Now, without meaning to, he had chosen life again. The cabin rose out of the canyon's bend like a scar on the land. Rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, and walls that had held nothing but silence for a decade. Caleb pushed the door open with his shoulder, the weight of the woman in his arms heavy, though she seemed no more substantial than a child. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust, old pine, and grief. Every dent in the table, every crack in the hearth, carried a memory Caleb had buried but never escaped. He laid her gently on the cot in the corner, its rope frame groaning under a weight it had not borne in years. For a long while he simply stood there, staring at her. The firelight flickered across her face, streaked with dirt and exhaustion. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. She was alive, but only just. A voice rose unbidden in his mind, sharp and merciless. "What are you doing, Caleb?" This cabin was his fortress, his tomb. He had promised himself never again to care, never again to risk losing what mattered. Yet here was a stranger, breaking open the silence he had guarded for 10 long years. He paced the floor, each board creaking under his boots like a protest. He could leave her, ride at dawn to Silver Creek, hand her to Doc Miller, and let the world take its course. She wasn't his responsibility. She wasn't his burden. That was the safe choice, the choice silence demanded. But when his eyes returned to her, he saw more than a stranger. He saw the stubborn will in her features, even in sleep. He saw his wife Sarah's tenderness, remembered her bent over their boy, tending a scraped knee with quiet patience. He remembered Daniel's weight in his arms, the trust of a child who believed his father could keep the darkness at bay. Caleb had failed them once. He could not fail again. He crouched by the hearth, his movements slow, deliberate. He lit the fire, set water to warm in the blackened pot, and took down the tin box that held scraps of cloth and a needle. His hands, rough from years of labor, trembled as he wrung a cloth in warm water. He knelt by the cot, hesitating only a moment before pressing the damp cloth gently against her swollen ankle. The woman flinched in her sleep, a soft sound escaping her lips, half pain, half relief. Caleb's chest tightened. He had not heard another human voice in so long, and the sound seemed to echo in the hollows of his soul. When he pulled the cloth away, he realized his own hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of ghosts. Every act of care felt like betrayal. Betrayal of the silence, betrayal of his vow to live without love. And yet he could not stop. As the fire warmed the small cabin, Caleb knew his life had shifted. The tomb he had built for his memories was no longer empty. Against his will, he had opened the door. CTA-1. Caleb Thorne's cabin had never been meant for the living. It stood on the rim of a southern Arizona canyon like a monument to grief. Its walls blackened from the fire that had once devoured his family. Its hearth long cold except for the small flames that kept him from freezing. Inside, every dent in the table, every chip in the pitcher was a relic of a life burned away. For 10 years, he had preserved the silence as though it were sacred ground, a shrine where the ghosts of Sarah and Daniel could linger undisturbed. Now, that silence was broken by the ragged breath of the woman he had carried across the threshold. He laid her on the rope bed in the corner, the one Sarah had once kept neat with clean quilts and the smell of lavender. The bed groaned under her weight, not much more than a bundle of bones and dust, but it was the first time it had carried another body since the fire. Caleb stood over her, his shadow long against the wall, unsure if he had brought life into his cabin or invited death itself. Her ankle was swollen, purple beneath streaks of dried blood. Wolves had torn at her clothes, but the desert had done worse, stripping her skin raw, cracking her lips, burning her throat until she seemed more ghost than flesh. Caleb's hands, calloused from years of fencing and branding, hovered over her wounds. For 10 years those hands had built only walls. Now they trembled at the thought of mending something fragile. He stoked the fire, set a pot of water to boil, and knelt beside her with a damp cloth. The motion came back to him in fragments, like a dream he had once lived. Sarah on this very floor, dabbing their son's skinned knee with a tenderness that calmed the boy's tears. Caleb blinked hard, and the memory shattered. His hands were not Sarah's. His touch was clumsy, rough, and far too late to save anyone that mattered. Still, he pressed the cloth to the angry swelling of the woman's ankle. She stirred, a faint groan escaping her throat, but her eyes stayed shut. Caleb worked in silence, wiping away dirt, cleaning torn skin, wrapping the ankle with strips of linen torn from an old shirt. The simple act cracked something inside him. For a decade, he had sworn to let no one depend on him again. Now, here was a stranger whose very breath depended on what he did next. He sat back on his heels, sweat beading on his brow, though the night air was cool. His cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a test. The ghosts of Sarah and Daniel pressed close, their absence heavier than ever, as if demanding to know whether he would fail this life the way he had failed theirs. Caleb rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he sat down by the fire. He could walk away in the morning. He could put her on his horse, ride her to Silver Creek, hand her to Doc Miller, and be done with it. That was the sensible thing, the safe thing. But when he looked back at the cot, at the hollow of her cheeks, and the defiance even in her unconscious stillness, he knew he was already lying to himself. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It had weight, a pulse, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The night dragged on, heavy with the sound of her breathing. Caleb sat by the fire, staring at the slow dance of the flames as though they could tell him what to do. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted to the cot. The woman hadn't moved, except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Alive, but only just. By dawn, the cabin felt smaller, walls pressing in as though judging him. Caleb stood, restless, pacing the floorboards. He knew the simplest answer. Take her to Silver Creek, hand her to Doc Miller, walk away before anyone asked questions he didn't want to answer. But the thought turned his stomach. Silver Creek was no place for an Apache woman. He'd seen the way townsfolk spat when her people's name was mentioned, how suspicion hardened their eyes. To them, she would not be a woman in need of help. She would be a problem, a threat. If she lived, they would find a way to make her wish she hadn't. Caleb paused at the window, staring out at the canyon. He could almost hear Sarah's voice telling him to do the right thing. But what was right? To keep her here, in a house that was nothing but a tomb? To expose her to the hatred of men who had never forgiven the Apaches for fighting back? His hand drifted to the rifle propped against the wall. He remembered the fire, the night everything ended. He had been there. He had seen the flames devour the cabin while he stood helpless, the heat blistering his skin as Sarah and Daniel's screams tore through the night. He had sworn never again to stand in the middle of loss, powerless, and yet here he was. If he took her to town, he might as well be handing her back to the wolves. Different teeth, same hunger. If he kept her here, he risked dragging his ghosts into the light. Already, they whispered in the crackle of the fire, in the way her body seemed too light when he had carried her. His son's weight had felt the same once, fragile, dependent, sacred. Caleb clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. This was not his fight. She was not his responsibility. He had chosen solitude for a reason, to keep the world out, to keep himself from ever failing again. Letting her stay meant opening the door to everything he had buried: love, fear, responsibility. And if the world had taught him anything, it was that caring was dangerous. The woman stirred. A soft sound, like a bird's cry, escaped her throat. Her eyelids fluttered, but she did not wake. Caleb froze, caught in the snare of his own heart. In that sound, he heard every ghost he had tried to silence. He could not leave her, not to the wolves, not to the town, not to fate. The fire popped, a sharp report like a gunshot, and Caleb started. He realized then what terrified him most. Not that she might die, but that she might live, and he would have to face what that meant. He lowered himself into the chair again, the decision unspoken but certain. The road to Silver Creek might as well not exist. The battle was over, though he had no idea yet just how much he had lost, or perhaps gained. The days that followed were measured not in words, but in silence. Caleb moved through them with the grim efficiency of habit, fetching water, chopping wood, tending to the cattle. Yet every action felt different, shadowed by the knowledge that he was no longer alone. Each morning, he set a bowl of oatmeal and a mug of water on the table before stepping out to the yard. When he returned, the bowl would be empty, washed, and placed carefully back where it belonged. He never saw her eat. It was as though the food simply vanished, taken by a ghost too fragile to show itself in daylight. She moved quietly around the cabin, almost soundless. Her steps were so light that Caleb sometimes wondered if he had imagined them. Once, he came back from the fields and found the fire stoked, the coals glowing steady instead of dying to ash. Another time, he noticed the tools arranged neatly by the door, the way Sarah had once kept them. He said nothing, but inside, something twisted, pain, memory, and a strange new warmth he did not want to name. Nights were harder. The cabin was small, its silence heavy. Caleb would sit at the table, oiling the Winchester or carving a piece of wood, while she lay on the cot. He never looked directly at her, yet he felt her presence like a weight in the air. Sometimes she shifted, restless, and the ropes of the cot creaked. Sometimes she whispered in her sleep, words in a language he did not understand, sharp with pain.
He told himself he would not care. But when her breathing caught or turned ragged, he found his own chest tightening, as though his body betrayed him. The silence between them changed slowly. It was not the hollow silence of before, the kind that gnawed at his bones and filled his nights with ghosts. This was different. It was shared, a fragile truce between two people who had lost too much to risk words. One evening, as the sun bled red across the canyon rim, Caleb returned from repairing a fence to find her sitting up. She was at the table, her back straight though her frame trembled with weakness. The empty bowl sat before her.
She did not look at him, but she had chosen to eat in sight rather than in shadows. Caleb froze, then set his hat on the peg by the door as if nothing had changed. He ladled stew into his own bowl and sat down across from her. They ate in silence, two figures joined by nothing more than the scrape of spoons and the crackle of the fire. Yet to Caleb it felt like the loudest dinner he had shared in 10 years. When the bowls were empty, she rose slowly, carried them to the basin, and washed them. Her movements were deliberate, dignified, as though performing a ritual. For the first time, Caleb caught her eyes. Not for long, only a flicker. But in that flicker, he saw not just fear. He saw endurance. That night, lying awake, Caleb realized something unsettling. He no longer dreaded the silence. He listened to it, shared it, and found it no longer empty. For the first time in a decade, silence felt like company. The cabin stood at the canyon's edge like a scar, and behind it stretched a patch of earth Caleb had not touched in 10 years. It had once been Sarah's garden. She had bent over it in the early mornings, her laughter carrying with the scent of sage and thyme. Caleb used to bring her stones from the creek bed, and she'd set them in neat borders. Their son had toddled between the rows, pulling at blossoms with clumsy fists. After the fire, Caleb had let the soil go to weeds. He could not bear to see it alive when she was gone. Now, one afternoon, as he came in from riding the south fence, he saw movement there. Aiyana was kneeling in the dirt, her dark hair hanging loose over her shoulders. Her hands were busy among the brittle weeds, pulling, clearing, coaxing. The sight struck him harder than a bullet. His first instinct was anger. This was Sarah's ground, sacred and untouchable. He nearly called out, nearly told her to stop. But the words stuck in his throat. She moved with reverence. Each gesture was careful, as if she were tending a grave rather than disturbing it. He stood watching, hidden in the shadow of the barn, his chest aching with something he could not name. That evening, when he sat at the table, the stew tasted different. There was a flavor he hadn't known in years, sharp, green, alive. Aiyana ate across from him, silent as ever, her eyes lowered. Caleb lifted his spoon again, tasting the change. It was not just stew. It was Sarah's garden, brought back from death and stirred into his bowl. He ate slowly, almost cautiously, as though each bite might undo him. The memories came unbidden, Sarah humming over the pot, Daniel clapping his hands at the smell of supper. Caleb had thought those tastes and sounds gone forever. Yet here they were, resurrected in his mouth by the hands of a woman he barely knew. When he set his spoon down, his eyes met Aiyana's. She did not smile, did not speak. But there was something in the way she held his gaze, a question, or perhaps a quiet offering. Caleb looked away first, his jaw tight, his heart pounding as though he'd crossed some forbidden line. In the days that followed, he watched her tend the soil each afternoon. She pulled weeds, turned earth, and set small cuttings she must have found in the wild canyons. Caleb said nothing. He wanted to. He wanted to ask why, or how, or what she hoped would grow in such barren ground. But his throat would close each time, and he'd return to his work with the weight of unsaid words pressing heavy in his chest. One evening he lingered nearby, pretending to mend a fence post while his eyes strayed toward her. She was kneeling, hands stained with soil, her lips moving softly as if speaking to the earth itself.
Perhaps she prayed. Perhaps she remembered her own people's gardens, burned and gone like Sarah's. The sun dipped, painting her in gold and shadow. And for the first time in 10 years, Caleb felt the cabin was not only a tomb. Something was stirring in the soil, and in him, something that refused to stay dead. The storm came in hard from the west, hammering the canyon with rain and wind. The cabin shuddered under each gust, the roof groaning as if it might split apart. Inside, the fire cracked in the hearth, throwing restless shadows across the walls. Caleb sat with his rifle on his lap, cleaning it out of habit, his hand steady though his mind was not. Across from him, Aiyana sat close to the flames, her knees drawn up beneath the blanket he had given her. The storm lit her face in flashes, half shadow, half firelight, like a figure caught between two worlds. For a long while, there was only the storm and the hiss of water running down the chimney stones. Then her voice came, soft and sudden, cutting through the noise like a blade. They came at dawn. Caleb froze. He did not look at her, afraid the wrong glance might close her mouth again. He simply listened. The sky was blue and purple, like a bruise, she said slowly, her words halting, as if she were pulling them from a wound not yet healed. We heard nothing, no horses, no warning, only the guns. Her hand trembled where it clutched the blanket. She stared into the fire, her eyes unfocused, as though she were watching the flames consume her past all over again. "They did not speak," she whispered. "Not one word. Only the shots. My mother fell first, then my brother. My father tried to fight, but there were too many." She swallowed hard, her throat working, as if the words themselves were knives. "The soldiers wore buttons that shone like suns. That is all I remember. Shining buttons and the smell of smoke." Caleb's chest tightened. He could see it without needing her details. The chaos, the screaming, the sudden silence that follows slaughter. He knew the smell of smoke. He knew the way it clung to your soul, how it never left. Aiyana's voice faltered, breaking into fragments, scattered pieces of memory laid bare. Running through cactus and stone until her feet bled.
Drinking from muddy water holes, sleeping with one eye open while the coyotes circled. Days and nights blurred into one another, her body failing even as her will forced it onward. "I kept running," she said finally, her voice raw, stripped of everything but truth. "They hunted us like animals. One by one we fell, my sisters, my cousins, all of them, until only I." She pressed her fist against her mouth, her shoulders shaking. "Only I remained." The fire snapped, sending sparks upward. Caleb sat unmoving, the rifle forgotten in his lap. Every word she spoke burrowed into him, not as a stranger's tale, but as his own reflection. He too had known what it meant to be the only one left, to carry the weight of ghosts. When her voice fell silent, the cabin filled with the storm's roar once more. Yet it was a different silence than before. Not the empty void of strangers, but the heavy, sacred hush after a confession. Caleb lifted his eyes to her, truly seeing her now. She was not just a woman he had pulled from the desert. She was a survivor, forged in fire and grief, carrying scars invisible as his own. And in her pain, he found his own mirrored back at him, clear and undeniable. The days after the storm carried a quietness unlike the silence before. It was no longer hollow, but heavy, filled with the echo of her story. Caleb felt it in the way Aiyana moved, slowly, cautiously, yet with a strength that was undeniable. He had heard the fragments of her loss, and now every gesture, every glance carried a deeper weight. He found himself watching her when he thought she would not notice. The way she traced her fingers over the grain of the wooden table, as if feeling for a memory. The way her eyes scanned the ridges each morning, wary but unyielding. He saw himself in those habits. She lived as one who expected the world to take everything from her, and yet she kept living. One morning, he returned from tending the cattle to find her in Sarah's garden. The small square of earth had long been left to weeds, but Aiyana was on her knees, her hands deep in the soil. She pulled gently at the roots, separating what was alive from what was dead. "You should let that patch go," Caleb muttered, leaning against the fence. "Too dry, never took much even when—" He stopped, the name of his wife caught in his throat. Aiyana did not look up. "The earth remembers," she said simply. She held up a sprig of green, small but sturdy. "If you tend to it, it gives back." That evening, when he sat down to his stew, the taste surprised him. It was sharper, livelier, wild sage perhaps, or something like it. He looked across the table at her, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt the faintest stirring of life at his own hearth. In return, he began to show her his world. He put tools in her hands, hammer, saw, shovel, guiding her through the work that had become his ritual of survival. At first, she moved with the hesitancy of someone afraid to break what she touched. But soon her motions grew sure. She learned how to mend a fence, how to split a log clean with a single stroke, how to lead a horse without pulling too hard. And she taught him as well. At night, when the chores were done, she would sit on the porch and point to the stars. She spoke their Apache names, stories of coyotes chasing fire across the sky, of spirits walking the Milky Way. Caleb had read maps once when he dreamed of traveling beyond the canyon. But her stories were maps of another kind, maps of meaning, of memory. She showed him which plants in the canyon could heal a fever, which roots could be boiled for strength. She told him of how to listen to the wind, not just for the weather, but for the voices it carried. Caleb, for the first time in years, listened. Their silence shifted again. It was no longer the silence of strangers, nor the silence of grief. It was a shared silence, rich with understanding. Sometimes a glance was enough. Sometimes the quiet weight of her presence beside him on the porch felt like the first prayer he had ever truly spoken. Two broken souls, each carrying scars unseen, had begun to speak a language beyond words, the language of loss and of what might yet be rebuilt. CTA 2. The morning was quiet. Too quiet. Caleb rode the fence line as he always did, the sun climbing pale and sharp over the canyon rim. The air smelled of mesquite and dust, the kind of day when nothing should stir but the wind. Yet halfway down the trail, his horse shied, its ears pricked, nostrils flaring at something Caleb had not yet seen. He swung out of the saddle and crouched low. There, pressed deep into the soft dust of the arroyo floor, was a print. Not hoof, not wolf, a boot. He brushed the edge with his fingertips, fresh, the leather tread still sharp, not blurred by wind or time. Whoever had walked here had done so within hours, perhaps minutes. Caleb's stomach knotted. No ranch hand, no neighbor would be this far out. The print was wrong. Too heavy, too purposeful. He rose, scanning the ridge lines, the canyon mouth. Nothing moved. The world lay still, but the silence felt altered, as if holding its breath. For weeks now, he had known this might come. The story Aiyana had told him, the shining buttons, the slaughter at dawn, had burned itself into his thoughts. Men had hunted her once. They would not stop hunting. He followed the tracks a short way, each step careful, his rifle loose in his grip. More prints joined the first, spaced in a line. 4, maybe 5 men, riding together, walking the arroyo, circling his land like wolves in human form. At the bend, he found a mark in the dust where a rider had paused, turning his horse to face the canyon. The hoofprint pointed straight toward Caleb's cabin. He stood there a long time, the desert heat rising around him. He had known peace was fragile, but seeing those prints drove it home with the force of a hammer. The walls of his cabin, the fragile truce of silence he had built with Aiyana, it could all be shattered in a moment. Caleb wiped the sweat from his brow. His old life, the 10 years of hiding from the world, was gone the moment he had carried her across his threshold. Now the world had found them, and there would be no hiding. He mounted his horse and turned toward the cabin. The ride back was short, but every sound, the creak of leather, the jangle of bit and rein, rang louder than it should. He could not shake the image of the boot prints, stamped like a warning into the earth. When he reached the yard, Aiyana was there, kneeling once more in the garden she had coaxed back to life. She looked up, dirt on her hands, her eyes questioning. Caleb hesitated, then spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "They found us," he said. Her gaze did not falter. She simply stood, brushing soil from her palms, as if she had expected this all along. The garden, the silence, the fragile peace, they had been borrowed time. Now the debt had come due.
Caleb tightened his jaw, feeling the weight of his rifle across his back. For the first time in 10 years, he knew he could not turn away. The boot prints had marked the line between the past and what must come next, and there was no going back. The sun dropped fast that evening, swallowed by the canyon rim, leaving the sky bruised with red and violet. Caleb set a lantern on the porch rail, then doused it. Better darkness than light that could give them away. He lowered himself into the rocking chair with his Winchester across his knees, the wood worn smooth by years of use. The air was sharp with the scent of creosote after a hot day, the kind of smell that usually meant peace, but not tonight. Every sound carried menace, the rustle of mesquite, the scrape of rock rolling down the slope, the cry of a coyote far off. Each one felt like a footstep closer. Caleb kept his eyes on the ridge, where the last line of light bled into shadow. Somewhere out there, 4 men were waiting. He didn't know if they would come at dawn or in the dead of night, but he knew they would come. Boot prints didn't lie.
Hours passed, measured by the slow creak of the chair and the tick of his thumb against the rifle's trigger guard. His body sat still, but his mind roamed, back to the fire that had taken Sarah and Daniel, to the long years of silence he had thought would protect him. He had sworn never to guard anything again, never to let his heart become a target. And yet here he was, keeping watch for a woman who had stepped into his life like a shadow from another world. The door behind him creaked open. Caleb didn't turn. He didn't need to. The sound was too light to be an intruder. Aiyana stepped onto the porch, her feet bare against the boards. She carried a blanket over her arm, the old wool one Caleb used only in winter. Without a word, she draped it across his shoulders. The touch startled him more than any gunshot. For 10 years no one had come close enough to offer comfort. The warmth of the wool, faint with the smell of cedar, seeped into him like something forbidden. She moved to the rail, standing just behind him, her eyes on the same horizon. The silence between them was heavy, but not empty. It was an agreement, a covenant spoken without sound. They would face whatever came together. Caleb shifted the rifle in his lap, adjusting his grip. He glanced at her, the lantern glow catching the line of her jaw, the defiance in her posture. She was not afraid. Or if she was, she carried the fear differently, as one who had already survived too much to flinch now. "Go inside," he murmured. The words came rough, unwilling, but they were all he could manage. She shook her head. Her gaze did not leave the ridgeline. Caleb said nothing more. He leaned back in the chair, blanket across his shoulders, rifle steady in his lap. The night stretched out before them, long and uncertain. But for the first time in a decade, he was not alone in the watch. And in that silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind, Caleb understood. This was no longer just his fight. The sun was merciless at noon, hanging high and white above the canyon. Heat shimmered off the dirt yard, curling the air into waves. Caleb stood on the porch, rifle resting easy in his hands, his eyes narrowed against the glare. They came in a line, slow and deliberate, 4 riders cutting across the open land. Dust rose around their horses' hooves, hanging in the still air like smoke. Caleb felt the weight of each hoofbeat travel through the earth and into his bones.
When they reached the yard, the lead rider drew up first. He was a broad man with a scar splitting his cheek, his hat pulled low, his eyes shaded but sharp. The others fanned out behind him, rifles across their saddles. The leader spat into the dust, then let his gaze travel to the porch. "Afternoon," he said, voice low, casual, like a man greeting a neighbor. "Heard you're keeping something that don't belong to you." Caleb said nothing. The rifle lay loose in his hands, not raised, not lowered. The silence stretched, heavy as the sun overhead. The man smiled thinly. "Apache woman, young, hurt. Matches the description of one that slipped past Fort Bowie after the raid. She's worth money to the right folks. You hand her over and we'll be on our way." Behind him, one of the others chuckled, tapping the butt of his rifle against his saddle. The sound echoed like a warning shot. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Ain't got anyone here but me," he said finally. His voice was gravel, steady, but his heart hammered in his chest.
The scarred man tilted his head, as if amused. "Now, see, that don't sit right. We followed prints, small feet, bare, lead right to this cabin. Either you're lying or you're blind." He leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes narrowing. "Which is it, Thorn?" The scarred man was a knife. Caleb didn't flinch, but his grip on the Winchester shifted, subtle but sure. 10 years of silence had ended the moment he carried Aiyana through his door. This was the cost. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the creak of leather, the impatient snort of a horse. Heat pressed down like a weight, the kind that made men reckless. Inside the cabin, Caleb knew, Aiyana was listening. He could almost feel her presence at the door, her breath held, her future hanging on his next word. He raised his chin. "No woman here," he said again, flat and final. The leader's smile died. His hand drifted to the Colt on his hip. The men behind him shifted in their saddles, fingers tightening on rifle stocks. The yard had become a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. Caleb's thumb brushed the steel of his rifle. He felt the line being drawn, invisible but absolute. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back. The standoff stretched, the sun beating down mercilessly. Caleb's finger rested along the trigger guard, his body a coil of stillness. The riders waited, sweat glistening on their faces, their horses stamping in the dust. Then, from behind him, came the sound he had dreaded, the creak of the cabin door. Caleb's heart lurched. He wanted to bark for her to stay inside, to remain unseen. But before he could speak, Aiyana stepped out into the blazing light. She moved slowly, every step deliberate, her bare feet silent against the porch boards. The blanket she had used at night was gone. Her hair fell loose across her shoulders, framing a face pale but unbroken. She walked past Caleb without hesitation, down the steps, into the yard where the dust swirled. The riders stiffened. The leader's smile slithered back across his scarred face. "There she is," he drawled. "Thought you could keep her hid, Thorn? Brave, but foolish." Aiyana stopped a few paces in front of Caleb, her body straight, her eyes unflinching. Her voice, when it came, was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am the one you seek." The words cut through the air like a blade. Caleb's breath caught. It was not surrender he heard. It was something fiercer, an offering, a defiance wrapped in sacrifice. She was not giving herself up because she was weak, but because she refused to let Caleb bleed for her. The scarred man chuckled low. "Smart girl, saves us trouble." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Climb up, and we'll be on our way." Aiyana didn't move. She simply stood, her chin high, her gaze unwavering. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, carrying the smell of dust and sage. To Caleb, she seemed carved from the same stone as the canyon cliffs, scarred, enduring, unbreakable.
Caleb's chest burned. For weeks, he had thought of her as someone to protect, someone fragile, a reminder of what he had lost. But here, in the face of death, she was no victim. She was a warrior in her own right, and her courage forced his own hand. He stepped forward, the boards creaking beneath his boots as he came down off the porch. The rifle stayed low, but his body blocked her from the riders. His shadow fell across her shoulders, wide and solid. The leader frowned, his smirk fading. "What's this, Thorn?"
"She just saved your skin, and you're still looking for a fight?" Caleb's eyes never left the man's. "She doesn't go anywhere with you?" he said, voice steady, iron hard. For a heartbeat, silence held them all. Dust drifted in the noon light. Horses shifted, restless. Aiyana did not flinch, but Caleb felt the faint brush of her hand at his back, a touch not of weakness, but of solidarity. And in that touch, Caleb understood the truth. They were no longer alone. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The yard lay still, but the air thrummed with danger. Caleb could feel it in the sweat crawling down his neck, in the restless stamping of the horses, in the hard gleam of 4 pairs of eyes fixed on him. Noon light fell straight and merciless, burning every shadow away. There was nowhere left to hide. He stepped fully into the dust, boots grinding against the dry earth. The Winchester came up in one smooth motion, the barrel steady and aimed square at the leader's chest. The scarred man froze, his smirk breaking into a scowl. One of the others shifted in his saddle, raising his rifle half an inch before Caleb's voice stopped him cold. "Don't," Caleb said, just one word. Low, final. For 10 years, his silence had been a prison. Now it was a weapon. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The canyon heat pressed down harder, the kind that made tempers short and fingers twitch. Yet Caleb stood firm, broad-shouldered, weathered, every line of him carved with resolve. "She stays," he said, each word striking like a hammer. "She's under my protection." The declaration hung in the air, heavier than gunpowder. Caleb felt Aiyana behind him, a presence strong as bedrock. He didn't need to look to know her eyes were steady, her back straight. But he knew what his words meant. This was no longer just about her. It was about him. For the first time since Sarah and Daniel's deaths, he had chosen life over silence. The leader barked a laugh, sharp and ugly. "Your protection? Don't be a fool, Thorn. You know what she is, Apache, savage. You think the law's gonna thank you for sheltering her?" Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. "I don't give a damn about the law," he said, voice steady as stone. "Not when the law's written in blood and ashes." The rider's smile faltered. He had expected resistance, maybe fear, but not this. Not a man ready to burn with his stand. The yard became a battlefield of stillness. Every detail sharpened, the creak of saddle leather, the buzz of a fly circling, the faint scrape of Aiyana's breath behind him. Caleb's whole world narrowed to the space between his rifle barrel and the man's heart. A breeze stirred, carrying grit across the ground. It drew a pale line in the dust between Caleb and the riders, a line that needed no words. The leader's horse snorted, uneasy. The man cursed under his breath, shifting in the saddle. "You're a damn fool, Thorn," he spat. "Maybe," Caleb answered, "but I'm still standing here." He didn't blink. He didn't lower the rifle. The line was drawn, and every man present knew crossing it would cost blood. For a long moment, no one moved. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the sun burning high and merciless above them. Caleb's rifle stayed leveled, his fingers steady, his eyes locked on the scarred man. Every nerve screamed, waiting for the explosion of violence. The leader shifted in the saddle, jaw tight. His horse sidestepped, nostrils flaring, picking up on the tension. The other riders glanced at one another, weighing odds, hands tightening on their rifles but not yet lifting them. They had expected an easy claim, not a man willing to stand his ground with death already in his eyes. "You'll die for her," the scarred man said finally, his voice low, dangerous. Caleb didn't blink. "Then I'll die standing." The words cut through the noon heat sharper than any bullet. For a heartbeat, the men wavered. Dust swirled across the line that had been drawn between them, erasing and redrawing it with every gust. The canyon felt like a crucible, pressing down until something had to break. A crow screamed overhead, sudden and harsh. The horses jerked, restless, stamping the earth. The moment snapped like a rope pulled too tight. The scarred man cursed, yanked on his reins, and spat into the dust. "Not worth it," he growled. "She ain't worth it." He turned his horse sharply, the others following after a beat of hesitation. Their hoofbeats thundered across the hard ground, fading toward the horizon. Dust rose in their wake, curling in the dry air like smoke from a dying fire. Caleb stood rooted in place, the rifle still raised, until the last echo of hooves disappeared into silence. Only then did he lower the barrel. His shoulders sagged, every muscle aching from the strain of holding steady. Behind him he felt Aiyana's presence, silent, unshaken. She had not flinched when the guns hung ready. She had not begged, not hidden. She had stood, as he had, with nothing but resolve. Caleb turned to face her. For a long while, neither spoke. The garden she had revived lay behind her, a patch of green defying the desert. Her eyes met his, dark and steady, carrying both the weight of all she had lost and the unspoken truth of what they had just won. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Maybe," Caleb admitted. He slid the Winchester back to rest against his shoulder. His voice was hoarse, worn thin by heat and tension. "But so will I." Aiyana's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something harder, something like respect. She gave a single nod. The wind stirred again, carrying with it the scent of sage and earth freshly turned. The yard that had moments ago been a battlefield now seemed strangely still, as if the land itself acknowledged the stand that had been made. Caleb looked at the fading dust on the horizon. 10 years of silence, 10 years of running from ghosts had ended with this moment. He was no longer a man hiding in grief. He was a man who had chosen to stand. CTA 3. The canyon had never been so quiet. No hoofbeats, no shouted threats, no clatter of rifles. Only the whisper of wind and the rustle of mesquite leaves, carrying with it a stillness so heavy Caleb felt it in his bones. He stood in the yard until the last swirl of dust had settled, until the horizon lay empty, as though the riders had been swallowed by the desert itself. When at last he turned, Aiyana was there. She had not moved far from where she stood during the standoff, her posture straight, her eyes steady. Yet as Caleb looked closer, he saw the tremor in her hands, the faint sheen of tears glinting in the corners of her eyes. He crossed to her slowly, the rifle hanging limp at his side. For a moment, neither spoke. He searched your face, expecting fear, expecting anger, but finding something else entirely, something like grief, yes, but mingled with an emotion he had not seen in years, trust. Her breath hitched, sharp and sudden, and then the tears broke free. They slipped down her cheeks silently, carving lines through the dust. Aiyana did not sob, did not crumble. She stood tall even as she wept, her tears not of weakness, but of release. Caleb's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to offer words that might soothe, but none came. Instead, his hand lifted of its own accord, rough fingers brushing the dampness from her cheek. The gesture startled him. He had not touched another living soul with tenderness since Sarah. Yet Aiyana did not flinch. She leaned into his hand, just slightly, as though accepting what little comfort he could give. His voice came low, almost broken. For 10 years, this house was only ghosts.
I thought if I stayed silent, if I kept to myself, I could live with it. But I wasn't living. I was just waiting to die." The words tumbled out like stones dislodged from a dam. His chest felt raw, scraped clean by the confession. "You came here, and I thought you were another ghost, something that would vanish if I looked too long. But you brought life back. The garden, the fire, the silence. It's not empty anymore. It's—" He stopped, the word choking him. "It's peace." Aiyana's tears slowed, her dark eyes searching his. She reached up and touched his wrist, where his hand still lingered against her cheek. Her fingers were cool, steady, grounding him. "I did not bring it," she said softly. "It was here, buried. You only needed someone to remind you it was not gone." Caleb swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I failed them," he whispered. "Sarah, Daniel, I failed them, and I've been failing ever since." Her hand pressed firmer to his wrist, steady as stone. "You failed no one by standing today. You gave more than words. You gave yourself." The truth of it struck him deeper than any wound. He had stood. Not for Sarah, not for Daniel, not even for the memory of what he had lost. He had stood for Aiyana, for the woman who had walked into his silence and turned it into something living again. A long breath left him, shuddering, heavy, with years of weight finally released.
The desert night settled in around them, the first stars pricking through the darkening sky. Caleb lowered his hand, but the warmth of her touch lingered. They returned to the porch together, the rifles leaned aside, the silence between them no longer burdened but shared. Aiyana sat with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, Caleb beside her, both staring out at the canyon where the last glow of sun faded to dusk. And for the first time in 10 years, Caleb did not fear the night. He welcomed it because he was no longer alone within it.